My name is Darla Stevens, I'm 32 years old, and last week I got married in a $5 million mansion. My mom always used to say, "Dreamer Darla, come back to reality. You don't have a chance of getting married at your age." As David's private jet took off for our honeymoon to Paris, I remembered exactly what my mother had said to me just 6 months ago at Christmas dinner in front of 20 family members: "You might never get married, and that's okay too. Not everyone is meant for marriage and family life." If you've ever been told you're too old, too picky, or not good enough to find love, let me know where you're watching from and hit that subscribe button. Trust me, this story will show you that sometimes the people who doubt you the most are the ones who end up eating their words in the most spectacular way possible. Growing up as the oldest of 3 daughters in suburban Atlanta, I was always the responsible one, the achiever, the daughter who had everything figured out academically and professionally from an early age. My parents, Robert and Linda Stevens, ran a successful insurance agency called Stevens Family Insurance that had been providing financial security to middle-class families throughout Georgia for over 20 years. They were well-respected pillars of the community, financially stable members of the local country club, and had very clear, traditional expectations for their daughters' futures. My younger sisters, Jessica and Amanda, followed the conventional paths that made my parents beam with pride at every family gathering and social event. Jessica married her college boyfriend Michael Wright after graduation at 22, moved into a charming starter home in the suburbs, had her first child Emma by 24, and was pregnant with her second by 26. Her life looked like a Pinterest board come to life: beautiful suburban house with a wraparound porch, white minivan in the driveway, perfectly coordinated family photos at every holiday and season. Amanda found her husband Derek through mutual friends at 25, had an elaborate church wedding that cost my parents $40,000 and was featured prominently in the society pages of the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, and was planning her dream house with a white picket fence and rose garden by 27. She worked part-time at an upscale boutique in Buckhead while her husband handled all the finances and major decisions, exactly the kind of traditional arrangement my parents considered ideal for modern women. Both of my sisters lived within 30 minutes of our childhood home in Buckhead, creating the perfect picture of multi-generational family togetherness that my parents had always envisioned for their retirement years. Sunday dinners with grandchildren running around the backyard, joint family vacations to Disney World and Myrtle Beach, babies spending weekends at Grandma and Grandpa's house while their parents enjoyed date nights at country club events. It was everything they dreamed of when they started their family in the 1980s. I, on the other hand, had different priorities and a completely different timeline for my life that seemed to confuse and frustrate my family at every turn. After graduating summa cum laude from Emory University with a degree in marketing and communications, plus a minor in digital media that I'd practically had to create myself through independent study and internships, I made the decision that would define the next decade of my life. I moved to New York City to pursue my career in digital advertising at Morrison Associates, one of the most competitive and prestigious agencies in the country. While my sisters were planning weddings, organizing baby showers, and decorating nurseries, I was working 60-hour weeks, climbing the corporate ladder in an industry that was notorious for burning out young professionals within their first 2 years, and building the kind of professional reputation that opened doors to opportunities most people could only dream of achieving in their entire careers. I wasn't avoiding relationships or deliberately choosing career over family, as my parents seemed to believe based on their constant commentary about my lifestyle choices. It was about timing, readiness, personal growth, financial stability, and refusing to settle for good enough just to meet other people's arbitrary timelines about when I should be married and producing grandchildren. I wanted to be financially independent, emotionally mature, professionally established, and genuinely ready for partnership rather than settling for convenience or succumbing to social pressure from family members who couldn't understand my choices. My family never understood this approach to life and relationships, and their confusion quickly evolved into active disapproval and increasingly harsh criticism of my lifestyle choices and priorities. Every family gathering became an uncomfortable interrogation about my dating life, my biological clock, and my increasingly unrealistic standards for potential partners. "You can't be this picky forever, Darla," became my mother's favorite refrain, delivered with the kind of concerned tone typically reserved for discussing a serious character flaw or mental health issue. "Good men don't wait around for women who think they're too good for everyone they meet. You're going to price yourself out of the marriage market entirely." By my late 20s, the family pressure had intensified significantly and became the dominant theme of every conversation we had, whether in person during visits or over the phone during our weekly check-ins. Family dinners were punctuated with pointed stories about friends' daughters who had settled down nicely with realistic expectations, and gentle but persistent suggestions that I should lower my expectations and focus on what really matters in life instead of chasing impossible dreams and fairy tale romance. The implication was crystal clear: my career success, my financial independence, my master's degree that I'd earned while working full-time, my promotion to senior account director with a six-figure salary. None of it meant anything if I couldn't find a husband and produce grandchildren for them to show off to their friends and neighbors at social events. "You're 30 years old, Darla," my mother said during one particularly memorable Thanksgiving dinner, her voice carrying across the dining room so everyone could hear her assessment of my failures and shortcomings. "Jessica already has 2 beautiful children and is expecting her third, Amanda's planning her second baby and looking at bigger houses, and you're still playing house in New York like you're fresh out of college. When are you going to get serious about your actual future instead of this extended adolescence?" "I am serious about my future," I replied, trying to keep my voice level despite the familiar frustration rising in my chest. "I just built a campaign that increased client revenue by 40% and won 3 industry awards. I was promoted to senior account director with a team of 8 people reporting to me. I'm doing well professionally and personally." "That's lovely, dear," she said with the kind of dismissive smile typically reserved for children who don't understand adult concerns and responsibilities. "But careers don't keep you warm at night or take care of you when you're old and need support. What happens when you're 40 and completely alone with nothing but work achievements to show for your entire life?" The conversations became progressively more pointed and increasingly hurtful as I approached 31. Family members began sharing cautionary tales about women who had waited too long and ended up alone with nothing but cats and regrets, as if my single status was a cautionary tale in progress rather than a conscious choice about timing and compatibility. "You know, Darla," my Aunt Patricia said during my 31st birthday party, pulling me aside with the conspiratorial air of someone offering crucial life advice, "my neighbor's son Jonathan is divorced now. He's got 2 kids from his first marriage and some debt from the divorce settlement, but he's a nice man with a steady job at the post office and his own health insurance. Maybe it's time to consider men with a little history and some baggage. You can't afford to be choosy anymore at your age." The assumption that I should be grateful for anyone willing to date a woman over 30 was both insulting and heartbreaking. These weren't people trying to help me find love and happiness, they were people who had decided I was running out of options and needed to lower my standards accordingly to avoid the terrible fate of becoming a spinster. The absolute breaking point came during last Christmas, just 8 months ago. The entire extended family had gathered at my parents' house for our traditional holiday celebration that had been happening for as long as I could remember. The house was decorated with enough lights to power a small city, and the dining room table groaned under the weight of traditional Southern holiday foods that had been prepared for days in advance by my mother and aunts. Jessica was pregnant with her 3rd child and glowing with that special radiance that comes from having your life perfectly aligned with family expectations and social norms. She spent most of the evening discussing nursery themes and baby names while her husband Michael doted on her every need and my parents fussed over her comfort and dietary requirements. Amanda was showing off photos of her new house, complete with a nursery that had been featured in Southern Living magazine and a playroom that looked like a high-end toy store explosion. And I was fielding the usual barrage of increasingly personal questions about my love life, my biological clock, and my apparent inability to find a suitable partner despite living in a city with millions of people and unlimited dating opportunities through apps, work events, and social connections. "Still no boyfriend, Darla?" my cousin Michael asked with the kind of false sympathy that made my teeth clench and my hands tighten around my wine glass. I would have thought New York would be full of eligible men looking for a successful, accomplished woman like yourself. "I'm dating," I said vaguely, which was technically true. I'd been on several dates with different men throughout the year, a lawyer named James who talked only about billable hours, a teacher called Ryan who seemed intimidated by my salary, an architect named Steven who kept suggesting I should move back to Atlanta, a marketing executive named Chris who spent our entire dinner checking his phone, but nothing had developed into a serious relationship worth discussing at family gatherings or defending against their scrutiny. "Dating or just going through the motions?" my mother interjected from across the room, where she'd been arranging Christmas cookies with the kind of precision that suggested she'd been listening to every word of our conversation. "Because at your age, dating needs to have a clear purpose and direction. You can't just play around anymore like you're still in college experimenting with different types of men." What followed was the most humiliating conversation of my adult life. In front of 20 family members, aunts, uncles, cousins, grandparents, and family friends who'd known me since childhood, my mother launched into a detailed public analysis of my romantic failures, my unrealistic expectations, and my rapidly diminishing prospects for marriage and children. The problem with Darla, she said, addressing the room as if I weren't sitting right there in the chair next to the Christmas tree, is that she thinks she's too good for normal, everyday men who would make perfectly adequate husbands and fathers. She's been spoiled by city life and career success. She expects some Prince Charming to sweep her off her feet, but that's not how real life works for women our age. I don't expect a prince, I said quietly, but she continued as if I hadn't spoken, her voice gaining momentum as she warmed to her favorite theme of my personal failures and character defects. She's 31 years old, living in an expensive apartment she can barely afford on her salary, working all the time with no work-life balance, and wondering why she can't find a good man who wants to build a life with her. Well, good men want wives who will prioritize family over career advancement. They want women who understand that marriage requires significant compromise and sacrifice. What kind of compromise? I asked, though I suspected I already knew the answer based on years of similar conversations and her opinions about women's roles in society and marriage. Career compromise, she said matter-of-factly, as if stating an obvious truth that everyone understood except me. Location compromise. Lifestyle compromise. Priority compromise. Financial compromise. You can't expect a man to rearrange his entire life around your ambitions and your timeline. At some point, women need to choose what really matters in life. The room had fallen completely silent, with various family members looking uncomfortable but no one willing to challenge her assessment or defend my choices and lifestyle. I felt exposed, criticized, and fundamentally misunderstood by the people who were supposed to support me unconditionally through life's challenges. And honestly, my mother continued, clearly enjoying having a captive audience for her theories about my failures and character flaws. I think you need to face reality about your situation. You're not 25 anymore. Your options are getting more limited every year that passes. Maybe it's time to consider that you might never get married, and that's okay too. Not everyone is meant for marriage and family life. Those words, "you might never get married," hit like a physical blow to my chest. Not because I feared being single forever, but because of the casual cruelty with which she delivered them in front of our entire family, as if my worth as a person was directly tied to my marital status and my ability to produce grandchildren for her to show off. Some women are just career women, she added with a dismissive shrug, and there's nothing wrong with that path, I suppose. It's just different from what most normal women want from life. That night, lying in my childhood bedroom surrounded by the remnants of my teenage years, old posters, high school trophies, college acceptance letters, debate team awards, honor society certificates, scholarship notifications, I made a decision that would change the entire trajectory of my life. I was completely done seeking approval from people who couldn't understand or appreciate the life I'd built through my own efforts and determination. I was done defending my choices to family members who saw my independence as a character flaw rather than a strength. I was done explaining why I wouldn't settle for good enough to satisfy other people's timelines and expectations about when I should be married. Most importantly, I was done allowing their narrow definitions of success and happiness to make me question my own worth and life choices. I returned to New York after that Christmas with a completely new perspective on my life and my future relationships. If I was going to find love, it would be on my terms, with someone who appreciated my ambition rather than seeing it as an obstacle to overcome. I wasn't going to settle for good enough or better than nothing to make my family feel better about my unconventional choices. 3 months later, in March, I met David Harrison at a charity gala for childhood literacy held at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. The event was one of those elegant New York affairs where accomplished people gathered to support important causes while wearing their finest attire and making valuable professional and social connections that could benefit both their careers and their philanthropic interests. I was there representing my agency's pro bono work with educational nonprofits, wearing a sophisticated black cocktail dress that I'd splurged on specifically for the event. He was there as one of the primary sponsors, though I didn't know that crucial detail at the time. Our first conversation lasted 45 minutes and covered everything from sustainable business practices to travel experiences in Southeast Asia to our shared love of obscure documentary films about historical events and social issues. He was intelligent, well-read, genuinely funny, and most importantly, he seemed genuinely interested in my work rather than seeing it as a temporary phase before marriage and motherhood. I run a consulting firm that helps companies optimize their environmental impact, he said when I asked about his work, his eyes lighting up with genuine passion for his field. It's challenging but incredibly rewarding. We're basically helping corporations realize that environmental responsibility and profitability aren't mutually exclusive concepts. What drew you to advertising? The conversation flowed naturally and effortlessly, without the forced politeness or obvious agenda that characterized so many dates I'd experienced over the years. When he asked for my number at the end of the evening, it felt like the beginning of a genuine connection rather than another disappointing attempt at forced romance. Our first official date was dinner at a small Italian restaurant in Brooklyn that he discovered through a food blogger's recommendation. Nothing pretentious or obviously expensive, just incredible food, excellent wine, and conversation that lasted until the restaurant staff began stacking chairs around us, gently indicating that we'd closed the place down without realizing it. Over the following weeks, we saw each other regularly but without pressure or unrealistic expectations. Museum exhibitions on Saturday afternoons, coffee and pastries on Sunday mornings, long walks through different Manhattan neighborhoods while discussing everything from politics to literature to our respective career goals and personal philosophies about life and relationships. What impressed me most about David wasn't his obvious professional success, though he was clearly doing very well financially, but his genuine curiosity about the world and his complete respect for my independence and ambition. He never questioned my work schedule, never suggested that I should be looking for something more family-friendly, never implied that my career was a temporary distraction from more important priorities like marriage and children. "I love how passionate you are about your work," he said during one of our early dates as we walked through Central Park on a beautiful spring afternoon. "It's incredibly attractive when someone knows exactly what they want and goes after it with complete commitment and integrity." It wasn't until our 6th or 7th date that I began to understand the true scope of David's professional success and financial resources. We were having dinner at his apartment, a stunning penthouse in Manhattan with floor-to-ceiling windows offering panoramic views of Central Park and the city skyline, when the conversation turned to his business operations and client base. "You mentioned you run a consulting firm," I said, admiring the museum-quality artwork hanging throughout his apartment and the obviously expensive furnishings that spoke of both wealth and refined taste. "How many people work with you?" "About 200 across 4 offices," he said casually, as if discussing something as mundane as the weather forecast. "We've been expanding internationally over the past 3 years, which has been exciting but logistically complicated." 200 employees meant David's consulting firm was significantly larger and more successful than I'd understood from our previous conversations. The penthouse apartment, the expensive artwork, the casual mention of international expansion, pieces of a much larger picture were beginning to form in my mind. "What kind of consulting exactly?" I asked, my curiosity genuinely piqued by this new information about his business operations and client relationships. "Environmental sustainability for major corporations and government agencies. We help companies reduce their carbon footprint while improving operational efficiency and profitability." It turns out environmental responsibility and business success aren't just compatible, they're synergistic when implemented correctly with proper planning and execution. A Google search later that evening revealed what David had been too modest to mention during our conversations. Harrison Environmental Solutions was one of the fastest-growing consulting firms in the country, with an impressive client roster that included Fortune 500 companies, federal agencies, and international corporations seeking to improve their environmental practices while maintaining profitability. David himself had been featured in Forbes, Business Week, Harvard Business Review, and Environmental Science Technology as an innovator in sustainable business practices. More significantly, his company's recent acquisition of 2 smaller firms and expansion into European and Asian markets had positioned him among the most successful entrepreneurs under 40 in his field. The financial details weren't made public, but industry estimates and business publication profiles suggested his personal net worth was somewhere in the tens of millions, possibly higher given his company's rapid growth and dominant market position in the environmental consulting space. This discovery created an interesting personal dilemma for me. David clearly didn't want his wealth to define our relationship or influence how I perceived him as a person, and I genuinely appreciated his understated approach to discussing his success. But it also meant I was dating someone whose financial resources exceeded anything my family could have imagined when they were lecturing me about lowering my standards and accepting realistic options. Our relationship deepened significantly over the following months. David met my work colleagues during a company happy hour, I was introduced to his close friends during a weekend barbecue at his house in the Hamptons, and we began making plans that extended weeks and months into the future rather than just the next weekend or month. By summer, we were spending most weekends together, either in the city exploring new restaurants and cultural events, or at his family's estate on Long Island where we could relax away from the intensity of our respective careers. By fall, the conversation had naturally turned to moving in together and making our relationship officially permanent. "I know we haven't talked extensively about long-term expectations or timelines," David said during a quiet dinner at his apartment one evening in October, "but I want you to know that I'm completely serious about this relationship. About us building a future together." I'm serious too, I replied, feeling the absolute truth of those words settle between us like a foundation being carefully laid. Good, he said, reaching across the table to take my hand with the kind of gentle reverence that made my heart race. Because I think we should start making concrete plans for our life together. The proposal came on New Year's Eve, during a private dinner at his penthouse that he'd arranged with his personal chef. Nothing elaborate or public, just David, me, candlelight, champagne, and a ring that literally took my breath away when he opened the velvet box. A 15-carat diamond surrounded by smaller stones, elegant and sophisticated without being ostentatious or vulgar. The kind of ring that appears in jewelry magazines as an example of timeless perfection and appears in museum exhibitions about fine jewelry design. Darla Stevens, he said, dropping to one knee beside our dining table while fireworks began exploding over Central Park in the distance, you're the most remarkable woman I've ever known. You're intelligent, ambitious, compassionate, and completely authentic in every situation. Will you marry me and build an extraordinary life together? Through tears of pure joy and overwhelming love, I said yes without hesitation or doubt. The next challenge was telling my family about our engagement and beginning to plan a wedding that would reflect both our personalities and David's family traditions. I'd spoken about David during occasional phone calls over the past year, but I'd been deliberately vague about the details of his professional success and financial resources. They knew I was dating someone seriously for the first time in years, but they had no idea about his wealth or the scale of his business achievements. I called my parents the day after New Year's to share the news of our engagement, expecting typical questions about wedding timelines, venue preferences, and guest list considerations. My mother's reaction was cautiously optimistic, obvious relief that I'd finally found someone willing to marry their 32-year-old daughter, mixed with intense curiosity about this man who'd agreed to take on what she'd publicly declared was a challenging proposition. That's absolutely wonderful, sweetheart, she said, though I could hear the unspoken questions in her voice and sense her mind racing with implications. Tell me everything about David. What does he do for work? Where exactly did you meet? How long have you been keeping this serious relationship secret from your family? He runs a very successful consulting business, I said, sticking to the basic facts without elaborating on the scope of his operations or his wealth. We met at a charity event for childhood literacy. We're thinking about a spring wedding. Consulting, she repeated thoughtfully, as if testing the word. That's nice, I suppose. What kind of consulting exactly? Environmental sustainability for corporations and government agencies, I replied. Oh. Her tone suggested this wasn't quite the traditional career path she'd hoped to hear about. Well, that sounds very specialized and modern. Is it steady work? Is there good money in that field these days? I almost laughed out loud at her concern about David's financial stability. His company generated hundreds of millions in annual revenue, but my mother was worried about job security and earning potential. It's extremely steady work, I assured her, understating the situation dramatically. David's built a very strong, successful business with an excellent reputation in his industry. Good, that's good, she said, relief evident in her voice. And he knows about your career situation? He's supportive of your work commitments and travel schedule? He understands about your priorities? This question revealed everything about her assumptions and past criticisms. She fully expected David to be threatened by my professional success or to demand that I scale back my ambitions for the sake of marriage, just as she'd always suggested I should do to make myself more attractive to potential husbands. He's completely supportive, I said firmly. He loves that I'm passionate about my work. He thinks my career achievements are impressive and attractive. Well, she said, and I could practically hear her brain processing this unexpected information, that's nice, I suppose. Modern men are more understanding about these things than they used to be. The engagement announcement to our extended family generated similar reactions, polite congratulations mixed with subtle questions about David's suitability, financial stability, and long-term intentions. Notably, no one asked whether I was happy, whether David treated me well, or whether we were compatible as partners. The focus was entirely on whether he could provide security and whether he understood what he was supposedly getting into by marrying an older woman with career ambitions. Planning the wedding revealed another layer of my family's assumptions about my relationship and David's resources. When I mentioned that we'd found a beautiful venue for the ceremony, David's family estate in the Hamptons, my mother's excitement was immediate, intense, and completely focused on the social implications. Estate, she repeated breathlessly. What kind of estate exactly? How big is this property? Will there be other wealthy families there? Will we meet important people? His family has owned oceanfront property on Long Island for several generations, I said carefully, not wanting to oversell the situation. It's a lovely oceanfront setting for a wedding ceremony. Oceanfront, she repeated dreamily. How many acres? What kind of house? How many bedrooms? Will we be staying there too? The questions intensified dramatically when she learned that David was handling the majority of the wedding expenses. Not because I couldn't afford my share of the costs, but because he wanted to celebrate in a style that reflected his family's traditions and because he had financial resources that made my contributions essentially unnecessary. He's paying for everything, she asked, her voice rising with excitement. The venue, the catering, the flowers, the music, the photographer, the whole reception. We're planning it together as equal partners, I said diplomatically. David wants our wedding to be special and memorable for both of us. This David must be doing exceptionally well for himself, my father interjected, having joined the conversation with obvious interest in the financial implications. What exactly is his business worth? How successful is this consulting firm of his? I don't know the specific financial details, I lied smoothly, though I'd seen enough documentation to understand that David's wealth far exceeded their wildest dreams or expectations. As the wedding planning progressed over the following months, my family's attitude toward me underwent a complete and dramatic transformation. Suddenly, I wasn't the career-obsessed daughter who'd waited too long to settle down and had probably missed her chance at happiness and family life. Instead, I was the brilliant daughter who'd strategically landed a successful, wealthy husband despite their previous predictions of romantic doom and spinsterhood. The shift was both deeply satisfying and somewhat disturbing. My worth in their eyes had changed not because of anything I'd accomplished personally or professionally, but entirely because of the man I was marrying and his financial resources. They were proud of me now, but only because David's success reflected well on our family's social status and their parenting abilities. The wedding itself was everything I'd dreamed of but had never expected to experience. David's family estate was a stunning oceanfront property with professionally maintained gardens that had been featured in Architectural Digest, Coastal Living, and House Beautiful. The ceremony was held on the lawn overlooking the Atlantic Ocean, with the reception in a custom glass pavilion that created the magical illusion of dining directly on the beach under the stars. 400 guests attended, including business leaders, entertainment personalities, politicians, academics, and international figures who were part of David's extensive professional and social network. The guest list alone made it clear that this wasn't just a wedding but a significant social and business event that would be remembered and talked about for years. My family arrived 3 days early for pre-wedding festivities, staying in the estate's guest houses and luxury accommodations that were nicer than most five-star resort hotels. My mother spent the first day taking photographs of every detail of the property, clearly planning to share evidence of this lifestyle with everyone back home in Atlanta. I had absolutely no idea that David came from this kind of established wealth, she said during the rehearsal dinner, gesturing toward the opulent surroundings with obvious awe. You certainly chose well, sweetheart. This is beyond anything we could have imagined for our family. The comment stung because it reduced my relationship to a calculated financial decision rather than a genuine love story, but I was too happy and too focused on celebrating to let her perspective diminish my joy. The ceremony itself was absolutely perfect in every detail. David looked incredibly handsome in his custom-made tuxedo, and I felt beautiful and confident in a designer gown that had been created specifically for me by one of the world's most sought-after wedding dress designers. As we exchanged vows overlooking the ocean, surrounded by people we loved and respected, I felt complete and fulfilled in a way I'd never experienced. This was exactly the kind of partnership I'd always wanted, built on mutual respect, shared values, and genuine appreciation for each other's strengths and ambitions. But perhaps the most satisfying moment of the entire celebration came during the reception, when my mother was making her way through the crowd, introducing herself to David's successful friends, business associates, and family members with obvious pride and social climbing enthusiasm. "This is my daughter Darla," I heard her say to a group that included a Fortune 500 CEO, a federal judge, a best-selling author, and an Academy Award-winning filmmaker. "She's always been so focused and determined in everything she does. We always knew she'd find someone truly special when she was ready to settle down." The revisionist history was absolutely stunning in its audacity and shamelessness. Just 8 months earlier, she'd publicly declared in front of our entire extended family that I would probably never get married and should accept that reality. Now, she was taking full credit for my relationship success and claiming she'd always believed in my approach to dating and relationships. Later that evening, as David and I prepared to leave for our honeymoon aboard his family's private jet, my mother pulled me aside for what she clearly intended as a meaningful private conversation. "I want you to know how incredibly proud I am of you," she said, tears forming in her eyes. "You were absolutely right to wait for the right man. David is perfect for you, and this wedding was like something from a fairy tale." "Thank you," I said graciously, choosing not to remind her of our devastating Christmas conversation just 8 months earlier. I hope you know that we always supported your choices and your independence, she continued, apparently believing her own revised version of our family history. We just worried about you being alone in that big city without family support nearby. This was as close to an apology as I was ever likely to receive from her, and I decided to accept it in the generous spirit it was offered. She was proud of me now, even if that pride was complicated by her assumptions about wealth, status, and social climbing. As our plane lifted off for Paris, where we'd spend 3 weeks touring vineyards, visiting world-famous art museums, and enjoying the kind of luxury travel I'd never experienced, I reflected on the incredible journey that had brought me to this moment of complete happiness and fulfillment. I'd spent years being told by my own family that I was too old, too picky, too career-focused, and too demanding to find lasting love and happiness. Instead, I'd found a partnership that enhanced rather than diminished my professional ambitions and personal goals. David reached for my hand as the East Coast disappeared below us in the darkness. Any regrets about anything? He asked with the kind of satisfied smile that comes from perfect happiness. Absolutely none, I said, meaning it completely and feeling grateful for every choice I'd made. This is exactly the life I always wanted and worked toward. My mother had been wrong about virtually everything that mattered. I hadn't needed to lower my standards, sacrifice my career goals, or settle for good enough to avoid being alone. I'd found extraordinary love precisely because I'd refused to compromise on what mattered most to me and my vision for my future. Sometimes the best revenge against people who doubt your choices isn't proving them wrong through argument or confrontation, it's building a life so fulfilling and successful that their opinions become completely irrelevant to your happiness and sense of self-worth. That's exactly what I accomplished, and the view from David's private jet at 40,000 feet was absolutely spectacular.